My very first girlfriend in 8th grade. Are you guys ready to see 8th grade Johnny? Yeah! All right. This is the height of the scene era. I had some straightened hair, and it was all kinds of fun stuff. I'm with my very first girlfriend here. We dated for a total of 2 weeks, right? Very long, a long relationship there. We hung out a total of all of one time outside of school. And this is what we did. We rode around in somebody's car. I don't even remember who was driving us around. But I thought it was the coolest thing. I was like head over heels about this girl. I was so in love, right? And then 2 weeks later, we break up, and I'm just devastated, right? Maybe you've experienced that. Anybody experienced some heartbreak yet? Yeah, just one over there, right? All right, well, the reason I bring this up is because tonight there's a little love in the air for Ruth, right? Now, we've been talking about the book of Ruth in the Old Testament for some time now. We've been going through chapter by chapter in the book of Ruth for the last several weeks, and I want to give you a quick recap of what we've learned so far. So we've learned several things about Ruth. First of all, we've learned that Ruth is a foreign woman who's from a land called Moab, and she's married to an Israelite man, right? One of God's people, an Israelite man. And unfortunately for Ruth, her husband dies, right? Really puts a downer on the love story that I've just hyped up here. But Ruth decides to remain loyal to her husband's mother, who's named Naomi. And so she moves back to Israel with Naomi. She cares for Naomi and starts following God. And so despite all of this incredible suffering that Ruth and Naomi are experiencing, the hardship that they're having, Ruth is showing some really selfless loyalty towards Naomi. Now, last week, we read chapter 2, where we learned about how God showed compassion. He was displaying his compassion towards Ruth in the midst of her hardship. For example, in her hunger, he fed her. In her vulnerability, he protected her. As a widow, God lined up someone to redeem her. And in the midst of all of this season of life where she's grieving and she's in need, God is blessing and encouraging her. And all of this was done through a man named Boaz. But God was really the one who is organizing these compassionate blessings that Ruth is receiving. So now tonight we will see how God continues to bless Ruth and draw Ruth closer to God with what I like to call Ruth's love story. Everybody say, "Aw." Aw. All right, so we're going to go through part by part of this chapter about Ruth's love story, and we're going to talk about it piece by piece. So I'm going to read the first section here, the first couple verses, and then we'll talk about it. So you guys look up at the screen, follow along with me as I read the first few verses of Ruth chapter 3. This is what it says. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not rest for you that it may be, should I not seek rest for you that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." All right, so if you were here last week, you might remember that we talked about a custom called the kinsman redeemer. Maybe you remember that weird word that we talked about. But the idea is that Boaz is being presented to Ruth as a potential husband for her, to redeem her from the suffering that she is facing as a widow. Right? The culture that she's in at that time meant that unless Ruth remarries, she is headed for a lifetime of poverty and hunger and suffering. And Boaz, through the kinsman redeemer custom that is presented to her, could save her from this terrible life. And this is what Naomi is meaning when she says to Ruth, "Should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" She's trying to get her hooked up with a dude. So she's trying to find her a husband. So let's see the next section where we see her instructions to Ruth. This is what she says. Maybe. That's not right. Let's get that pulled up on the screen. Verse 3. All right, this is what she says. Naomi says to Ruth, "Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and laid down. You guys, Ruth is getting rizzy. See, she's got her makeup done. She's putting on some self-tanner. She's got a new dress. She looks good, right? She is going to find Boaz in the middle of the night, and she's going to lay on top of his feet, right? I know, right? Doesn't that sound kind of creepy? It's kind of creepy, right? But the point is that Ruth is putting it, The point is this, that Ruth is putting everything out there to show Boaz that she is very interested in him. But this wasn't exactly her idea. Who told her to do this? Naomi, right? So Naomi is meddling, trying to get Ruth and Boaz together. It's like that stereotypical old lady who's the matchmaker, right? When I was a kid, my grandma was all about that, right? Like, I can remember playing with family friends, and they'd have their kids with them, and my grandma would constantly look for whatever little girl that I was playing with and point out to everybody, "Oh, that's Johnny's crush, that's Johnny's girlfriend," right? Anybody's grandma do that to them? Oh, okay, just me. My grandma was super embarrassing, but she was trying to set up these little love stories or whatever, but it would always cause some sort of embarrassment, always cause some sort of harm in the process. And Naomi is exactly like this in this story. Naomi is trying to set up Ruth and Boaz. But Naomi's meddling leads Ruth to approach this in a way that was manipulative and a little bit unusual, right? See, she objectified Ruth by telling her to make herself beautiful and to give herself the advantage by bathing and putting on perfume and dressing in fresh clothes. She tells Ruth to sneak around and not be seen until after Boaz falls asleep so that Boaz won't dismiss her and tell her to leave. She tells Ruth to make the advance on Boaz, towards Boaz, which was something that was very uncommon for the woman to be making the advances in the relationship in that culture. None of this was explicitly sinful, but Naomi and Ruth are both trying to turn the odds in their favor rather than trust in the Lord to provide. Naomi and Ruth are trying to turn the odds in their favor rather than trust in the Lord to provide. See, God has been providing for them throughout this story. They've been in incredible suffering throughout this story. They've been experiencing famine. They've gone to foreign countries where they're unfamiliar and uncomfortable. They've lost their closest family members to them and they're grieving. But in the midst of that, God has been showing them compassion. He's been providing for them. He's been blessing them. He's been encouraging them. Yet, despite that, they're not trusting him to continue to provide for them, but they're advantaging themselves to make sure that they get what they want, right? They're being a little bit manipulative here. So now we move into the next section where we see this unusual proposal. Here's what happens in the next section of Ruth chapter 3. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." And he said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman." And now it is true that I am a redeemer. Yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. All right, so Ruth is proposing to Boaz to get married, right? She's asking him to marry her, but she's saying it in a kind of unusual way, right? Like, she's doing this a little bit differently than what we're used to, and especially different to what they were used to in that time. It was very uncommon for the woman to make the first move, let alone propose marriage in that culture. But she also uses some weird phrasing here, right? She doesn't ask the question, Boaz, will you marry me? She instead says, spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Now, she is pointing out two things by saying this. First of all, she is requesting for Boaz to spread her wings over her. And this seems like a weird phrasing. This seems like what is she talking about here? But she's pointing back to something that Boaz said in the chapter we studied last week. This is what she says in Ruth chapter 2, verse 12. The Lord repay you for what you have done. The Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So this illustration of spreading your wings to take refuge, it's painting this word picture of God's compassion and blessing being like a mother bird caring for her ducklings, right? Like, she places them under the warmth and provides shelter and protection from the weather and gives them everything that they need when they aren't able to provide for themselves. And in the same way, she's asking Boaz to provide that for her as a widow. I can't provide for myself, so will you provide for me? Will you give me the blessing so that I don't have to live this miserable life of suffering and hardship? And this is in a time where Ruth is unable to do this for herself. Now, Boaz has given credit to how he is blessing Ruth as really being the Lord blessing Ruth through him. And so now, as Ruth asks Boaz to spread his wings over her, she is demonstrating that she is loyal to the Lord, and she recognizes Boaz as this physical representation of God's care for her. So how is she asking for Boaz to care for her? And that's by being her redeemer, right? She says, spread your wings over me, for you are a redeemer. Essentially what she's saying here is, now that I am a widow, please marry me so I'm not doomed to a life of suffering. Remember, within this culture, she couldn't just request for anyone to do this for her. She couldn't just ask anyone to get married to her. Instead, the practice, this custom, was that the closest relative to her deceased husband was to take her as his wife. And this was simply to ensure that there was no widow that was left forgotten and suffering, but that every single widow had the opportunity to be redeemed and to be cared for and to have a chance at new life there. And so, in other words, Ruth has said to Boaz, you have been the person through which God has been blessing me up to this point. Now will you continue to bless me in this hardship that I'm facing? Will you continue to show me God's love by marrying me? That's what Ruth is saying here to Boaz. And it's at this point when Ruth expresses this and points to God's care for her that Boaz realizes that Ruth's loyalty is not just to her mother-in-law Naomi, but Ruth has loyalty to the Lord. And so he speaks very highly of her. He requests that she is blessed by the Lord. He calls her a worthy woman. And what he's saying here is that she's not just a good person, but that she has truly adopted the ways of life of a God follower by submitting herself to all of these customs like the kinsman redeemer. So he responds to her by saying, I will do all that you ask. Meaning, yes, I will marry you, but, and this is a big but, there is some stuff that needs to be figured out first. There's some stuff that needs to be figured out first. Now, remember what we said about how this kinsman redeemer custom works. The closest relative to the deceased husband is the one that's supposed to take the widow as his wife. So Boaz reveals that while he is a relative of Ruth's deceased husband, he's not the closest relative to her deceased husband. So he expresses that while he wants to redeem her, he wants to take her as his wife, he needs to go and get permission from this closer relative first. And in doing this, Boaz does something really beautiful. See, Boaz demonstrates wisdom through his patience and willingness to follow the Lord's way above taking what he wants. Boaz demonstrates wisdom through his patience and willingness to follow the Lord's way above taking what he wants. He's not focused on giving in to emotional passion, but is focused on the greater blessing of Ruth's relationship with God, especially with her being a foreign woman who's not familiar with the Lord, who doesn't know God well, and is less familiar with these customs like the kinsman redeemer. He's trying to protect her here. And so Boaz is interested in Ruth. He wants to marry her, and he expresses that to her, but he is more committed to following the Lord than to getting what he wants. And so as we get into our last section here, we see the blessings of their patience as they wait on her Redeemer. This is what it says in our final section of Ruth tonight. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. And when she came to her mother-in-law, she said, "How did you fare, my daughter?" Then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave me. For he said to me, 'You must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law.'" She replied, "Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today." We're left on a cliffhanger, right? Boaz led Ruth into this wisdom of patiently waiting on the Lord instead of taking things for herself. But now we see him continue to bless her in the meantime, right? He's caring for her reputation. He talks about that he doesn't want anyone to, he doesn't want them to talk to anyone that she was at the threshing floor that night, because he doesn't want anyone to assume that there was any sort of funny business happening when she stayed the night. He's also continuing to provide food for her, right? Like, he's not providing just enough to sustain her, but he gave her 6 measures of barley. Now, this is a non-very descriptive measurement. It's not like a volume or like a bushel or anything like that. Like, he just says 6 measures. That could be 6 shovelfuls. That could be 6 handfuls, whatever. But I think what it's trying to communicate here is that it's not just sustaining Ruth, but it's giving her more than she needs. He's giving her as much as she could carry to bless her. So he's caring for her reputation. He's continuing to provide her food, and now he's also giving a willingness to redeem her. Now, although he's expressed that he wants to marry her the previous night, Boaz again expresses his desire to marry Ruth. And Ruth is forced by Boaz's leadership here to be patient, as opposed to the meddling that Naomi suggested. And it leads to continued blessing. And so through Boaz's wisdom, through his patience that he leads Ruth in, we see the value of waiting on the Redeemer. And so as we think about what this passage means for ourselves, I want you to think about a couple things. And the first is this: to submit to the Lord's will above your own will. Submit to the Lord's will above your own will. See, Boaz's response to Ruth's proposal serves as a contrast to Naomi, who is trying to rig the outcome in Ruth's favor. Boaz showed submission to God's will above his own. Naomi was trying to take advantage of the system. And in the same way, we can often try to take advantage of God. See, it may not be blatantly sinful, but more an attitude of, how can I get away with as much as possible without crossing the line of sin? How much of what I want can I get and still be a good follower of Jesus? The Bible doesn't explicitly say not to do this, so I don't think I need to feel guilty about doing that. We're really good at making ourselves feel okay about our sin and making ourselves feel okay about following ourselves instead of following God. But that's completely the opposite mindset of a follower of Jesus. We should have our eyes fixed on Jesus all the time, focusing on him instead of focusing on avoiding sin and guilt and hell. But so often we find ourselves focusing on those things, and it's this equivalent of walking backwards, of hiking backwards, right? Like, I'm a really big hiker. I have some pictures for you guys of years ago I went and hiked at Mount Washington in New Hampshire. And one of my favorite hikes that I ever did before. Really, really beautiful scenery, and that's like one of my favorite parts of hiking is I really enjoy getting to look and see all of the beautiful things that God's created as I walk around nature. And this beautiful hike, what made it so beautiful was that it constantly was changing. You can see in some of the pictures that there were sections where it was like these scenic wooded forests. There's other sections where it would you'd have to climb up like a rock wall and like boulder up the side of it. There was a section after that where it turned into just this giant rock field. There's no trees, there's no plants. The only thing that guides you through the way is piles of rocks that you're to follow until you get to the next one. And so I thought it was so awesome that there's all these different scenes in a single hike. And it was just incredibly beautiful. Once I got to the top, you could see down on the entire mountain and see all of the stuff that you just hiked. But it was just a beautiful thing as I'm looking at it. But in order to get there, I had to walk forward. I had to be focused on what was ahead. Right? Like, imagine that I hiked Mount Washington backwards. Like literally, like I'm walking backwards the whole way, looking at where I came from and not paying attention to where I'm going. That'd be a really great way for me to trip, to fall, or to get lost, right? And I never would have made it, right? Like even if I'm like walking backwards and every once in a while I look to see where I'm going, it's going to be really inefficient. I might make it, but like it's not the best way, is it? And as we follow God, we hike backwards a lot of times by putting the focus on ourselves, putting the focus on our will. Most of us live our lives looking back at the sin that we struggle with, the guilt that we're saved from, and the punishment of hell that we are trying to avoid. And occasionally we look back at God, right? Like I spent an hour and a half at midweek. I read my Bible today. I decided to pray right now, right? But most of the time, we're facing the wrong direction. And it's a really great system for your faith if you want to trip, fall, or get lost. See, as we follow God, we have to focus on him. We have to walk by faith, waiting on our Redeemer. See, just like Ruth, submitting to God's way and patiently awaiting her Redeemer, we have to walk by faith as we await our Redeemer, Jesus. Surrendering to him, hands open, your will, God, not mine. I want to follow you, not me, because I trust that you know better than I do. I trust that you have my good in mind and you know what's good for me better than I do. And it requires that you trust God with this. You trust God that he's going to fulfill his promises and that he wants what's good for you. It requires that you're patient because it's not always the timing you want, but it's the timing that God sees fit. It's not your job to lead, it's your job to follow. And all you need to do is just trust that God knows better than you and he desires what is good for you. So focus your life on following God, facing forward, looking at him, instead of constantly looking backwards and stumbling over yourself. So as we think about how to do this, this looks different for every single person in the room. And so I can't give you the formula of this is exactly what it looks like to live your life facing forward, walking towards God. That's for you to figure out, but we want to be alongside you, helping you along the way to figure that out. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to pray in just a second, but I want you to tonight talk to a leader about what this looks like for you. Maybe you have an idea, and so that's great. I want you to go talk to a leader and share with them and get their thoughts on that. Do you think that this would be helpful to me growing in my faith in Jesus? Maybe you have no clue. You have no idea what it looks like to walk facing forward towards God instead of focusing on where you came from. That's okay. A leader, anyone with these lanyards, we want to talk to you. We want to help you figure that out. That's why we're here. And so I want to challenge you to talk to a leader about this thing to help you figure out what that next step is for you. Now, I give this application almost every week to go talk to a leader, but I don't want you to ignore it because of that. Don't let me talking about that all the time and encouraging you to talk to a leader discourage you from taking an opportunity to grow in your faith. Maybe the courageous choice of talking to a leader about your faith when you might be scared or anxious to do so is your first step of facing towards God today. So I want to challenge you guys, if God is tugging at your heart right now, go talk to a leader as soon as I'm done praying. Don't wait on it. Go do it. But before I give you that chance, let's take a minute to pray. Will you guys bow your heads with me? God, thank you so much that you are a God that loves us, that you're compassionate towards us, and that you are with us in the midst of our hardships. That when we look back at the moments in our lives where you have been caring for us, we can look at your faithfulness and how you've been pointing us towards good, even when it's difficult to see. So, Lord, as we think about what it looks like to trust you with that in the future, help us to be able to stop focusing on the past, stop focusing on ourselves, but instead to focus ourselves on you, to turn ourselves towards you and to start walking towards you, facing forward. And Lord, I pray that you would give each of us a way to do that. Help us to figure out what that next step is. Lord, for the students that you are prompting right now, I pray that you give them the courage to go talk to a leader to help figure that out. But for each of us, Lord, we need you to be working in us to help guide us to whatever that next step is. Lord, we desire to follow you, and so we need your help in this. So we ask for it in the name of Jesus. Amen.